Give it a moment. There we go. Okay. Hi guys, welcome back to Views with Verse, the series where each week, hopefully, I talk to someone about their views on the universe and all things spiritual or related. And this week we have the Grand Infinity, and we're going to be talking about the goddess Morrigan. So welcome to Views with Verse.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And if you didn't know, we had a chat on his channel, which will be linked down below, as long as my brain works, which is no guarantee. And I remember to put the links down there. And you can check out that video where we also talked about the Morrigan. So I thought, we'll carry it on. We'll have a talk about personal gnosis today and kind of how our paths evolved a little bit and some personal experiences where we feel comfortable sharing them, and then maybe the unexpected. Because I was thinking about this recently, a lot of people have a very particular expectation of the goddess Morrigan, and some people are a little bit aggressive with newbies when they don't meet up to that expectation. So I thought if we talked about how our experiences are perhaps outside of what we anticipated or expected, maybe that will help with people who are having difficulty with beginning their path with the Morrigan. So that's it in a nutshell. That's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
So you're happy sort of just letting people know how the Morrigan came to you and how that began for you?
Yeah, I've had two different occasions where that kind of happened. We talked about that a little last time. And in both cases, the kind of short overview is that I got a feeling or an impression that something was trying to contact me before I reached out to do evocation. And prior to that, I had always chosen what I wanted to evoke and done things that way. And when trying to figure out what it was, there would be signs or symbols like crows showing up and things like that, which narrows the field down to, okay, is it the Morrigan? Is it Odin? Like, what is it? There's numerous deities that could fall under, but then just that drawing toward the Morrigan as the answer. And what made it so strange for me was in both cases when this happened, usually when I do evocation, it takes me a while to get fully into trance, to get fully immersed, to have some kind of a image come to mind, to have that connection occur. But with the Morrigan, both times, it was like the instant that I sat down and decided, okay, I'm ready to connect to the Morrigan, just like that, she's there. So it was almost like she was there the whole time, just like, I gotta wait for you.
She's behind the door, just waiting for you to open it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah.
And I haven't had that with any other entity I've worked with. I've only ever had that with the Morrigan.
So for me, she's always been there as long as I remember. And I would talk to Mother as a child, which got me all sorts of strange looks. Like, no, you pray to Father God, like, if you say so. like it was more real and tangible to me, even as a very small child, that there was a feminine voice, a feminine presence, and a strong feminine presence. It wasn't
right.
typically motherly, as perhaps we've come to expect mother figures to be from a Christo perspective. And there were all very weird synchronicities throughout my life that I didn't really notice until I look back many years later, like, oh, okay. And it's from the seemingly not very important to being very drawn to the colors that are associated with her, and working within Celtic magic and things without knowing I was until much later, and gut instincts and things. So this is more Celtic in general than Morrigan specifically, but when I started learning to circle cast and was learning about the four quarters and the towers and the watchtowers and this, that and the other, I never felt comfortable with that, and so I always drew on trees. So I'd have different trees in each corner. And at the time I was on a forum and I was like, does anyone else do this? This is 13-year-old me. Like, does anyone else do this? Because this works and it makes more sense. And there was a lot of women that were like, no, but I'm going to now because that sounds like a much better idea. And I was like, oh, okay. And that to me fed in later to when I realized that the Celtic path is what called me to me in the end. And I was like, oh, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
As for the Morrigan, crows were actually the last thing that came to me for the Morrigan. It started with wolves, and I've decided that I decided in my scholarly kind of brain that in nature, crows and ravens follow wolves about by the tail.
Hmm.
So they'll pick off the wolf's food and things once the wolf is done with it. And crows being crows, they probably pick off a bit, pushing it a bit before they've done. But that kind of, it felt like a cycle to me, like that once the wolves and everything else had passed through, that then the tail was when the crows came in. And boy, do the crows come in when the crows come in.
Hmm.
And I've had numerous experiences with crows, some crazy experiences with crows. One Samhain, when I was giving thanks back to the Morrigan, so this is after she'd spoken to me, I went to a local park and I looked up and there was no shadow of a lie about between 40 to 60 crows in like a vortex swirling around over the top. And it was like the most insane sort of confirmation of the Morrigan, because I think she's quite tangible at times. I
Hmm.
think she's one of the most physically present at times goddesses that I've ever encountered. So how about that? Do you feel like you've had lots of kind of big physical signs with it being the Morrigan, or do you feel
Yeah,
more
I actually was
ethereal?
just on another channel recently where someone asked me, what's the weirdest experience I've had with an entity? And of course, it ends up being the Morgan because all of the strangest things do.
She won't be
Uh,
beaten. Yeah.
right. But what to me is strange is maybe not so strange to others, but it was that there was a point in time where I was working through a shift that had happened, where I had had to accept some part of my past that I didn't want to face.
Hmm.
And I was in tears and I was going through it and kind of re-experiencing it. And I felt this tangible pressure on my head, this hand patting me, touching my head, like it's going to be okay.
Hmm.
I'm completely alone, but in my mind's eye, she's there, she's tapping me, but I felt it as real as anything else. And even though I've worked with other entities before, that level of physicality I've never felt with anyone else before.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings into a thread that I feel is very true for the Morrigan, and then some people are really hostile about the idea, because I think she does have a kind of motherly presence. I think she
Hmm.
does take care of those that she shows an interest in. And it's not again, it's not like that Christo mother-centric thing about being, placating everyone else. It's not about
Hmm.
being serving everyone else even. It's just, it's strengthening and it's empowering, but there's certainly a level of concern and consideration there. I don't think that she's divorced from humanity the way that a lot of people present her to be. I think people get caught up in the idea that she's kind of like just battle rage and just death, and then those things can't show compassion at all. And I always make arguments. I'm like, well, you can have a compassionate death,
Hmm.
so those two aren't mutually exclusive to begin with. And in warfare, you can be compassionate in certain circumstances. So
Hmm.
I think that's kind of block thinking when we're like separating the Morrigan from a caring perspective. So that's really interesting that you had that kind of experience, which is empowering and like caring in the same breath,
Yeah.
because it's very much.
And
Go
and
ahead.
if you think about sort of like warrior culture as opposed to the battlefield,
Hmm.
and how people don't just become warriors on their own. They're raised, they're trained, they have mentors that they look up to as if they're family. They look at their allies, their friends as family, their brothers or sisters in arms going out to fight.
Hmm.
That kind of feeling is there, like that united union.
Camaraderie, that kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can kind of get an aspect of war battle from her, but it's more that camaraderie, that like mentorship, that leadership that
Mm.
someone who's going to be tough on you but who cares about your progression would have.
Mm. I was talking the other day in another interview about the archetype of a warrior and what we felt that kind of meant versus like what it gets portrayed as being.
Yeah.
And we were talking about it in terms of like code of conduct and code of honor, because that was from a Chinese perspective. So it's not exactly the same, but that kind of code of conduct of ethics really does, for me, come into at least the evolution of what warrior is now. I mean,
Hmm.
you've got records of Celts being bloodthirsty and whatnot, but a lot of the records of this are from the enemies of the Celts.
Right.
So this is one of the big problems with a lot of the mythology, a lot of the historical recordings of even the Celts themselves, is how bloodthirsty are they versus how is that the Romans trying to make them out to be more savage, less civilized, like less human, so they needed to be conquered, that kind of thing, rather than it being the entirety of the truth? I mean, I know we've got recordings of battle frenzy through the myth. I've been reading about this for the last few days because it's all tied into the blood moon, and I've got a video coming where I'm like, right, we're going around the houses with this theory in the next one, because I've been reading into the idea of the battle frenzy, and which is like being ridden by Morrigan, being possessed by Morrigan is the idea behind the battle frenzy to a lot of the Celts. And I wondered how you felt, and how, if you had any kind of interactions where you felt like she took over you a little bit, and if that, how that felt and how that impacted, and things like that, and what that would be like for people who are looking outside in.
Yeah, definitely. And as we talked about in the first time we spoke, the first time I evoked her, I thought I was just going to do this one-off evocation, like I usually had done in the past with different entities. And she had kind of hinted at the idea that that was not how it was going to go, but I was stubborn. and you know very well that type of stubbornness will eventually get smacked, which it did.
I think she finds it endearing, but you will get smacked at the same time.
Yeah. But there was this feeling of danger for me when I first evoked her, because there was this feeling that she was going to get involved with me in a way that was different, that I didn't feel ready for personally, which is why it took me a year to get around to the point where I evoked her again. I had no idea at the time that it was going to be this regressive memory of my past traumas and working through them. But knowing that now and looking back to the feeling of fear I had, it was as if subconsciously I knew on some level that level of darkness was what I was going to have to face whenever I worked with her. And that's what had brought that fear about. But when I worked with her the second time, when I decided to evoke her, when she was calling to me again and I was seeing crows again, and I felt like I was ready to figure out what was going wrong with everything I was inside, and I reached out to her then, I had a similar meeting, but what she said to me was, you have to invite me in. She said, I want to help you, I want to work with you, but you have to invite me. You have to say, it's your decision. And I said, yes, I want to invite you in. And she said, well, let me make sure you know what that means. And she said that a part of her will always be inside of me, and a part of me will always be within her. And I said, yes, I accept that. And then there was this weird something that happened, which, we can't really explain. Some people will say psychological, some people will say spiritual. I don't really care. But there was something within me that felt like it woke up. And that's never gone away, even when I'm not working with her. But sometimes when working with her, that energy fills me strongly, like she's within me, not outside of me. And so I kind of get that concept, but it doesn't really feel like a possession. It's more like a union.
So for me, with the fact that she had always been there, the time that she finally began to make herself present in who she was actually, rather than just I'd been calling her mother forever and working with her and without realizing who she was. And when I asked her to tell me who she was, is when that began to happen. It really was like, oh, we're finally at that point, are we? And I was like, yes. To go deeper, it was a bit like opening the next gate in that thing, because a lot of people have I don't know if it's a distrust of the goddess Morrigan, or they're just overwhelmed, or they're afraid of what it might mean when she comes up. But I never had any of that, because obviously her presence had been around as long as I could remember, and it may well have shaped me along the way. So I may have taken on attributes from her that I admired and kind of tried to mold myself around them and try to become that.
Yeah, definitely.
So a lot of people are like, you're very Morrigan-esque. And I'm like, yes, it's probably because of that, because she's been around since I can remember, and that's kind of helped me make decisions. So the fear element isn't something that really affects me. I have moments of resistance, for sure, when she's like, right, so we're going to turn your life upside down. I'm like, no. No, I'm resisting. And she's like, you can resist, but you're coming like head or tails, you're coming. So pick which way you want to come, like on your ass or on your feet. So yeah, so I never had the kind of the big fear thing. Other people did. So when I started talking about the Morrigan and in my sort of closed circles as well as publicly, a lot of other people were really apprehensive. Like, are you sure you want to do this? Like,
Yeah.
and I was like, what's the matter with everybody? Like, why is everybody freaking out? And now she's a little bit more mainstream, which is a very interesting change for me, because when I first began, everybody was very apprehensive. There wasn't as many people talking about her. In YouTube, I think it was mainly just Laura Dallaghan that I ran into at that point that was talking about the Morrigan. And it's a little bit more broad now. You get a little bit more of an influx of opinions and experiences. And I was talking to people recently because there's quite a few people that have ran into this, you're not allowed to work with the Morrigan because, and I was wondering if you ever like ran into any of that, and then how you kind of deal with that, or how you kind of, because
I've run into that with any evocation of any entity for some reason. If I talk about it openly on YouTube, or if I used to do a segment called Get to Know a Deity, where I do a blurb on different deities. And with each one of them, there was something I had evoked. So I wanted to make sure I was doing my due diligence. But people will get on there all the time and be like, you're wrong about this and that and this. I'm like, dude, I'm just telling you what I got, you know? But I get that from a lot of people. People have their own unique experience that's very important to them. And I think that they're afraid to be, I want to say proven wrong, but even it wouldn't prove them wrong. It's your own experience. But they're afraid of other people having very different experiences. And it makes them have to question their experience. And as a result, they say, well, yours must be wrong because I know mine is real.
Very bothered about legitimizing what it is they've experienced to the point where they kind of project what anybody else has experienced. So I've actually had it more with the Morrigan, because every so often I'll do something for a different deity, because I conduit by nature. It's part of my job. And so every so often, and it tends to be easier for goddesses and gods that kind of align with her kind of vibration a little bit more easily. So I had a Lilith experience most recently, and that came through just crystal clear and easily done, and with the Morrigan's permission, of course, at all points. And so far, this is famous last words, now I've said it, but so far it's all been positive feedback with regards to that. But every time I talk about the Morrigan, there's someone somewhere that's like, no, this is wrong, how dare you? And the how dare you thing drives me crazy. I'm like, really, dude? There's a secret cult of Morriganites, and if you do not belong to the secret cult, then you may not speak about her. Stop. Like, what? So for me, I take on a kind of like an evolutionary perspective about the Morrigan. I think she evolves. I wondered how you felt about that, and how I've got stars falling out of my hair, which is really strange. The star glitter falling out my hair on camera.
Yeah, I mean, the culture is different in our society. So obviously our interactions with any of these deities is going to be different than it was for the past. If you think about think about yourself as a teenager and yourself now having a conversation with someone, and those conversations are going to be completely different because of your own change. Even if you were talking to an elder who they stayed the same between both periods of time. So whether she's changed or we've changed, I don't know, but there's a difference in the way the conversation is being had now.
I think it's kind of inevitable for me. If in my mind, like everything has changed, like nature changes, the world changes, everything's in cycles that flows and recedes. And even if we think that time isn't necessarily linear in the way that we perceive it to be, like in terms of the spiritual, maybe we can go back and forward, who knows, we just don't know. That makes more sense to me. That's my gut feeling, that time is not as linear as we think it is, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. And so it doesn't make sense to me to only view the Morrigan through the perspective of one point in history. and one
Yeah.
kind of people. And there are some people who refuse to see similarities in the Morrigan unless it's within the Irish mythology. And
Mm-hmm.
I love the mythology, I do, but I'm also a student of history, and I'm like, they weren't insular guys. They traveled, they
Yeah.
intermarried. You can see this from how the most amount of the Ogham left in the UK is in Wales.
Mm-hmm.
There's more in Wales left than there is anywhere else. I think there's some on the Isle of Wight, and I think they even had a mix of Ogham and Viking runes where somebody had like combined them, and he was a Viking and he left his name on this thing. I think that was the Isle of Wight, if I remember rightly. And it just shows you that these cultures were intermingling. And the similarities in myth, I don't think are any accident. I think they flow and evolve. And to me, we're exactly where we're supposed to be in terms of which incarnation we're in. We're learning the lessons we're supposed to be learning. And my final kind of word on that kind of thought is like, well, if you want to tell the goddess Morrigan she was wrong, you go ahead.
Yeah.
Like, you do that. See you later. Have fun
Well,
with that.
another thing is most people view Morgan as a goddess of death. And to me, and to many people who practice the occult or who have an Eastern mindset on some of these things, death is transformation. It's transition from one state to another. So to say that a goddess who is about transition and who is self-proclaimed a shapeshifter can't change over time would be kind of hilarious.
Yeah. Because I said on the last video that would be the word that I would pick if I was forced to describe her in one word, which I wouldn't like to do. But if I had to, then that would be the word that I would pick, more than a goddess of death, more than a goddess of magic, more than a goddess of warfare. I would pick shapeshifter. And there's examples of it in the mythos. She attacks Cuchulainn and she turns from, heifer and into an eel, into a wolf. And there's other stories where, depending on which aspect she's being seen in, which is something else I'll ask you in a minute actually, but like Babe is shown up as a leper and then transforms into a beautiful woman as part of the story. And a lot of her story is about the shift in one way or another, whether it be the physical shifting of her or the magical cowl that she's inciting people to fight over, or whatever it might be. There's always an element of things are not quite as you think they are, and there's that perspective element that comes in. And I think she fucks with people's perspective of her on purpose. I think
definitely.
So there's a good question. Do you work with her in like her entirety? Do you work with her in her aspects, or a bit of both? Or
she kind of appears to me how she wants to. That's how I see it. I don't have a huge amount of research around how one is typically supposed to work with the Morgan. It's more like just an organic thing that's happened on its own. And I only know it's her because she says it is, and I don't question it. But there's an energy there too, if you understand that concept. When she's there, I can tell it's her. I can tell it's the same person, same entity that I'm working with. But her form is almost always different every time that I work with her. So other entities, usually I'll get one or two different forms that they'll show up in. But for her, it's almost always universally a different form each time. There's different renditions of the same elements there. There's usually these kind of like, I don't want to say war paint, but like painted markings. There's sometimes these like crow feathers in the hair and stuff like that. Sometimes this like pulled back kind of shock of hair, and sometimes it's down. But like darker hair usually, sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes brown. There's a femininity to her all the time, whether she's showing up as an older person or a younger person. Like certain things are similar, but it's just different forms altogether otherwise.
I work more with the Babe aspect, and I think it's just, I don't know if it's just where I'm naturally drawn within in terms of energies. So for anyone who's new to this, there is some belief, and there are many beliefs, and then some people refuse to believe any of it, so it's entirely, personal. But some people see her as a triple goddess, and that she would have 3 aspects. Some people have suggested there might even have been 9 aspects originally, because there's the 9 Morgans of Avalon, or the nine Morgans is a mythos which may or may not be associated with her, or it may have been, that they were embodying the 9 aspects of the Morrigan as priestesses. There's that argument as well. It's a little bit more difficult to get any proof on that side of the myth. But generally speaking, people tend to fall into the idea that she's a triple goddess, and there's lots of descriptions of her being a triple, or as them being sisters, and it's all kind of, again, mythos. It intermingles and shapeshifts, and it's a bit difficult to pin it down. Generally speaking, people think of her as being the Morrigan, Mocha, and Bave. Or some people go with Anu, and then Mocha, and then Bave, and then some intermingle with Nemain, depending on their perspective. So for me, she's always come across as very strongly the Morrigan as a whole, or Bave, and Bave tends to be most frequent for me. So Bave is silver-haired for the most part, but sometimes she shows up and she's fully youthful, fully sensual, fully in her own sexual element. Still got a shock of silver hair and bright red lips, though. And sometimes she's half skeletal and rotting, and like anything to throw you off completely. And then sometimes she'll do her wizened old hag thing. And it's really, really weird, because she's a wizened old hag, and yet she's the most strong. You wouldn't mess with this wizard. She's not weak in any sense of the word at all.
Right.
And then her emphasis can shapeshift a lot of the time as well. So one of the weirder experiences that I've had more recently is that I actually woke up, and I woke up and I felt like I was like being pulled into trance, and I was like, what's going on? And I like went into trance and she was there, and the only way I can think to describe it is she was like pacing like a tiger in a cage, like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then she was howling, and then she was like she had like claws up, and like her fingernails had elongated, and her eyes were black. And the black eyes is something that happens to me in meditation when I'm seeing. It's her crow vision, or crow eyes is how she describes that, and that's something else that's happened to me. But she was like pacing like a crazy person, and she was like screaming and howling, and I was like, what is going? You woke me up to this. What are we doing? And she just looked at me and threw her head back and started howling with laughter. And she was like, can you handle me like this? I was like, if I have to, yes. And she was like, good. And that was it. And it was just one of those moments of like testing and pushing boundaries and pushing perception, and just because I was half awake, so I was probably not as reverent as people would probably suggest you be. I was like, what are we doing? That kind of thing. And so sometimes she's much more put together, much more stoic, much more warrior archetype, and then sometimes she's off the deep end, and I don't know what to tell you. That's that kind of battle frenzy kind of thing, though. That's what that was, I think, because that's been coming up a lot more recently about where the line is between sanity and madness, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's something that any of us practicing have to question all the time.
Yeah, exactly. There's a really interesting idea that sometimes to make magic happen, we have to believe it to the point of madness. And to like outside people, we'd look nuts, because we'd be like, yeah, it's happened, even though it's not happened yet. But we believe it so strongly that the universe has no choice but to fall in line to fill that vacuum. So she's been playing with that idea lately of like what the line is, and then that kind of battle frenzy, that rage, that pushing over, and that animalistic energy too. And we're like, right, we're taking things by halves then, are we? Like, no. So what would be a piece of advice if someone came to you and they said, I think it's the Morrigan and I'm not sure if it is, how would you kind of like address that? Because that's something I get a lot. And I'm really apprehensive about telling people.
Well, it depends. It depends on their practice for me, because some people are comfortable doing certain things and some people aren't. If you're somebody who practices evocation or things like that, then I would say go ahead and try a formal evocation. And if it's her, she'll come.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not, she probably won't, because that's the way she is.
Yeah.
So if you think it's her, try it out. I don't think that she'll show up for somebody who she doesn't want to. So you're not going to accidentally curse yourself or force yourself to work with her if you're not supposed to.
I think that's the best case scenario, to be honest. If you've irritated her in some way and she doesn't show up, I think that's the
Yeah.
best case scenario.
Yeah. And if you're someone who doesn't do evocation, you're more like someone who just meditates and has more of a mystical viewpoint. I
Mm-hmm.
would say to use that, go into meditation, but meditate on the concept of the Morgan, reach out openly, accepting whatever messages come to you. Acceptance and dropping the mind will help to
Mm-hmm.
get whatever messages are coming, and just accept that they're coming from who you need to hear it from, and
Mm-hmm.
then analyze those messages. And if it turns out to be the Morgan, you'll know from that as well.
Mm. And a lot of people kind of ask me, how do you know it is her? And I'm like, it's not. It's difficult to know it's not her. Is how I feel about it. Her energy is very different from any other god or goddess that I have ever met.
Mm-hmm.
There are similarities to other quote unquote dark goddesses and gods. It's a term I don't like very much, but for simplicity's sake. So she shares a little bit of the sensuality from Lilith, but it's not the same,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. But her energy is. It's kind of overwhelming, especially if you're not used to it. I mean, I've never been overwhelmed by it, but I understand why some people feel that way. She's very tangible, like I said. She's very present, and it's like her energy is almost tangible. It's like you can almost
It's very strong.
feel the energy in the air. It's like electricity sometimes. And then sometimes weird stuff does happen when she comes. It like doors stop slamming and things like that. That sort of thing happens quite a bit. Crows is a possibility. I know that it does happen to a lot of people, and often when I reach out to people are like, I'm being crow stalked now. Did you do this? And I'm like, Morrigan shows an interest. I can't help it.
Yeah.
But it's not the be all and end all, because I think a lot of people hook on to crows as if that's a definite sign that it is the Morrigan. And I'm always like, okay, well, what are the signs outside of that? Like,
Yeah.
because those are the ones that interest me to see where the similarities are. I was getting a lot of spearheads. That was one of the things that was weird and strange to me, because I had bought a Orthoceras, which is a fossil, because I knew some personal stuff was coming up that was going to be hard. And I went into the crystal shop and I had this overwhelming, undeniable kind of, you need that. You need to take that home with you, and you need to keep hot. And I was like, what is going on? Because that kind of pressure was huge. And for it to be that kind of, for a tool like that is unusual. So I was like, okay. And that was spear shaped. And then there were the obsidian arrowheads and things like that were popping up here, there, and everywhere. So there's a lot of spear mentality. I know what I was going to say with regards to the warrior archetype, and I completely forgot. I'm backtracking now. So with the warrior archetype, she's just reminded me, she was just like, Joe. I'm like, oh okay.
Mm-hmm.
Something that came through to me, which has stayed with me, and I built my main Morrigan spell oil off it, and I use nothing else for protection, is blade over shield. And she would say to me, blade over shield, shield over arm, arm over heart. That's what it means to be a warrior. And that was much more about the protection element. It was much more about the line of defense. And she would talk to me sometimes. She would say to me, it's a far better thing to be a shield. And I was looking at her like, okay, is it not better to have both? And she would be like, stop being facetious. But she was like, yes. But it's a far better thing if you can be one or the other. It's a far better thing to be a shield than it is to be the blade, because the shield is what defends your tribe, defends your family, defends your honor, defends what you're trying to defend, rather than a blade which can be just used for, like, in a venomous way, depending on how you choose to use it. So for me, like the archetype of the warrior coming through into the Morrigan energy is protective again. And I think there's a big misconception about who the Morrigan is based on this kind of warfare energy in this thing, because I've seen a lot of people be like, oh, she just wants to see the world burn.
And I think those are people who don't understand warfare. I think that's what it comes down to, because if you think of people who were great military leaders and things, wrote books on how to use strategy and things like that. We look at them as very wise individuals who made their way up the ranks, cared for their subordinates, worked their way into a place where they were wise old people, even in a war-torn place. That's the quintessential warrior to me, is this wise, experienced person. And people confuse it for a bloodthirsty animal or beast or someone who's out for destruction. They think that war is destruction, and it's not the same thing. A warrior archetype is not the same thing as a destroyer, and that's what I always say. I think it's because of the fact that she's war and death that people get that confused. But again, death is transformation, death is transition. War is defending yourself, standing up, being brave in the face of adversity. So she is very much both those things, but it's not in the negative light that people like to paint it.
And there've been people recently who've said to me that they've been told, again, that they're not allowed to work with the goddess Morrigan because they suffer with depression was one, anxiety is one, and things like that. And I was shocked because in a lot of ways, and this is what a lot of people have come back and said in response to me talking to these people, is that what the battle is going to change depending on who you are, what your life experience is. And for most of us in the West, excluding like the military and the police maybe, warfare is separate. It's not on our doorstep so much anymore. It's something that happens elsewhere, and for better or worse. And it's just a fact of how the world is right now. And it does take us away from the empathy element a bit with war. We don't see like the fallout of war, and that doesn't help us come to peace as easily. But on the other hand, we're quite divorced from it. And it's this evolution thing to me again, that just because a battle isn't the way that you perceive the way a battle should be, doesn't make it any less trying on the person. Because if you think about this, the mental and the physical state of a warrior, a Celtic warrior, you had to overcome certain fears in order to be a warrior. You would have had to have pushed past certain things. You would have had to learn to cope with pain in all the different ways. So just because the equivalent today is different doesn't make it any less, to my mind.
Yeah, people forget about what happens to the warriors when the war is over too, like all the post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. So if you're a Celtic warrior and you're fighting people with a blade, you're watching your friends get killed by the blade next to you while you're doing this. You may be a bloodthirsty warrior on the battlefield, but at night, what's happening to you in your mind? What are you having to heal and repair in order to be able to move forward and continue to strive to succeed? And actually, that type of repair is what the Morrigan seems to do, to take those traumas that are too much for the human psyche to handle and help you to process them. So it very much to me seems like she's still doing exactly what she would have done back then, if people just don't understand what it is.
Or they don't want to listen, maybe they don't. They've got an idealized form of what that meant back in Celtic times, or whatever you want to call it. And it's kind of looking back on history without really seeking to understand history. So, which is problematic anyway, because I'm a student of history. I can tell you just how little we have with regards to understanding, particularly when you get back to that point and further back. The evidence we have left is biased and fleeting, and there'll be things that are missing. I think one of the truest statements I've ever read is, there seems to be like we're missing a whole load of Morriganic myth, and what we've got is only bits. And I was like, that's exactly how I feel about it. I feel like there's a whole lot of untold stories when it comes to the Morrigan. And that's why personal gnosis to me is so important, because maybe we're getting reflections of what those stories would have been through our own experiences. And maybe by creating these videos, creating whatever it is that we put out, we're helping the survival of her mythos through a modern age. And without that, she falls into obscurity a little bit. And so that to me is one of the things that I really don't understand about people being like, you're not allowed to talk about her like this. It's like, do you realize by saying that people should be censored that you're trying to censor the mythos of the Morrigan, like the evolution of this goddess? I mean, we can talk about things that we don't feel vibrate the right way, and we can say why we feel that that isn't
Mm-hmm.
our experience of the Morrigan. And because, for example, I had somebody come to me a couple of years ago, and he was very upset, and he was like, I hate the Morrigan. And I was like, okay, why do you hate the Morrigan? He was like, I knew a priestess of the Morrigan, and she used me sexually, and she told me that this is what the Morrigan told her to do, and then she like messed with his head and left him high and dry and all the rest of it. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not the Morrigan, that's the individual that you knew. And given that the lack of ethics and the lack of honor in that, I'm not sure that that's
Right.
something that the Morrigan would condone. And then I think in that circumstance, it is important to speak against when that sort of thing happens,
Mm-hmm.
because that's people kind of using deity in any respect, which is something which happens a lot,
Yeah.
unfortunately, to justify their behavior. And I think that's where the difference is to me, is like when we're talking about human behavior, which is a bit shady and being justified with deity, whether it be bullying, whether it be that kind of abuse, whether any kind of abuses, this is something the church really, this is a problem with the church, that they will not, weed out their own
Right.
abuses and
Yeah.
enough until they're discovered. And for me, that's really important, especially within the Morganic practice, because she has this kind of honor that flows through everything, this kind of
Right.
duty that kind of flows through everything. So we're kind of coming up about time, because I've been yakking on. So sorry about that.
No problem.
Is there, how would you sum up her energies then to people? What would you say is most important for you when working with the Morrigan?
I guess transformation, because the death essence of it strikes me the strongest, but it isn't death the way most people think of that word. It's transformation, it's transition. So the ability to take what was there and transmute it seems to be the strength that I see.
Yeah, personal alchemy is right on the live wire of spirituality right now, with the energies that have come from the new moon going into the eclipse. It's all about personal alchemy and breaking down that which does not serve you, and rising up again. Absolutely. I agree. I think change, transformation, these are all key themes of how I interact with her too. I will say quickly before we run out of time, though, because I meant to say this earlier, if anybody's having the experience where she backs off and goes quiet, that's normal. I warn people about this all the time. I'm like, she does have her silent watcher side, so she does have that very physical, very tangible presence, and then she'll like zoop, and you'll still be able to feel her if you tug hard enough, but she kind of steps back and she kind of watches over what are you learning, the lessons that I have kind of imparted to you and like pushed you in the direction of. So to anybody who's experiencing that, that's regular, that happens a lot. Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today. We're about the 40-minute mark, and I'm just hoping that Zoom is not going to be like and cut us off right here at the end. So if you guys have any more questions for me or for the Grand Infinity, you can leave them down below or pop on over to his channel where he talks about things. If you've got anything you'd like to promote for yourself or your channel at the end here before we finish?
No, nothing new. I mean, I've just been doing these conversations with other people who practice right now. So if you're interested in that, check it out. My old content is still up, which was how to practice magic and things, the basics. Although my own path has changed a lot since working with the Morgan, that stuff is still pretty valuable, I think. So,
Cool.
If you're interested in any of that, check it out.
Okay, and I shall do my best to remember to put links down below so you guys can find it quickly and easily. Fingers crossed.
Thanks.
My brain is not the greatest. Memory, not my strong suit. Anyway, so thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you guys for watching. And we will catch you on the next Views with Verse. So many blessings.